The Holocaust was an endless litany of unspeakable horrors. Somewhere within that atrocious chapter of history, there would inevitably have to be one incident that stood above all others. A moment that represented the absolute pinnacle of evil amidst humanity's darkest atrocity. That moment was the Babi Yar Massacre. For 2 days on September 29th and 30th, 1941, 33,771 Jews were massacred by members of the Nazi Einsatzgruppen and their Ukrainian collaborators. It was the highest concentration of death in the entire Holocaust and stands as one of, if not the most, abominable crimes in history. Today, on A Day in History, we will take you through the Babi Yar Massacre. Who perpetrated it? Why? How? And delve into its complicated legacy. The Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union commenced on June 22, 1941. The armies of the Third Reich took the Soviets by surprise and seized hundreds of miles of territory in mere weeks. Accompanying the regular Wehrmacht soldiers were special units of the Einsatzgruppen. Formed during the invasion of Poland in 1939, this Einsatzgruppen had a simple mission: to achieve Hitler's racial goals in Eastern Europe. This meant the removal of those the Nazis deemed inferior, including Slavs, Roma Gypsies, and Jews. This could mean physical relocation, but too often it meant immediate execution. Never numbering more than a few thousand men at a time, fresh soldiers were regularly rotated in and out of the Einsatzgruppen, as German leaders found that the scale of murder they were asked to commit might break even the most devout of the Nazi frontline soldiers. In the first 9 months of Operation Barbarossa, the Einsatzgruppen claimed around 500,000 lives. The Ukrainian capital of Kyiv fell to the invaders on September 19, 1941. Most of the population had fled the city already, especially the Jews, who knew to expect mistreatment at Nazi hands. Around 35,000 Jews remained in the city when Nazi forces assumed control. Immediately, the Nazis set about destroying communist and pro-Soviet elements, destroying major buildings, and executing captured Soviet leaders. Episodes of sabotage were recorded in the days after the city's capture, which the Nazis blamed in large part on the city's Jewish population. As one report noted, Jews played a preeminent part, allegedly 150,000 Jews living here. Verification of these statements has not been possible yet. Execution of at least 50,000 Jews is anticipated. This pretext formed part of the basis for what came next, but really there was no future in which the Jews of Kyiv would be left unharmed. The Third Reich's racial ideology already called for the elimination of its declared racial enemies, and linking the Jews of Kyiv with sabotage was ultimately inconsequential. The Nazis had no shortage of other self-justifying excuses. Within days of the capture of Kyiv, leading officers of Army Group South met to discuss the fate of the city's Jews. Major General Kurt Eberhard and SS Obergruppenführer Friedrich Jeckeln, who had already directed the murder of hundreds of thousands of people on the Eastern Front, directed their subordinates to do the same to the Jewish population of Kyiv. The grisly duty fell to the Einsatzgruppen under the command of SS Brigadierführer Otto Rasch and SS Standartenführer Bob Lobel, with support from local Ukrainian collaborationist police forces. On September 27th, word was sent out to the Jews of the city that they were being resettled. They had to report to a designated meeting point at 7 a.m. on September 29th for deportation. Those who refused to appear would be shot. Most knew that the Nazis hated Jews, but the exact nature and depth of that hatred was not fully understood by most. Soviet authorities had suppressed information about Nazi treatment of Jews between 1939 and 1941 to avoid causing any issues with the relationship they'd built with the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939. Still, most of the Jews of Kyiv would have at least heard that the Nazis spoke about the forced resettlement of Jews, and so would not automatically suspect they were going to be killed. The assembly point was near the Lukyanova train station too, which helped convince Jews that this really was a deportation. The truth of the scale of the murder the Nazis could and would commit was not obvious to the people living through it, as it is to us in retrospect. So, over 30,000 of Kyiv's Jews obeyed the order to assemble, convinced they were only about to suffer the ordeal of deportation. The Jews still believed to the very last moment, one German report said, that indeed all that was happening was that they were being resettled. The miserable crowd could only bring what they could carry in their arms or on their backs, or in small wagons that they had to pull behind them. Children came laden with sacks of clothes, toys, and food. Families carried their most treasured possessions under their arms. They came with what little they could, what they believed would be the scraps upon which they'd have to build new lives wherever the Nazis put them. To their surprise, when the Nazis began moving them, they did not go to the train station. They were loaded onto trucks or marched on foot out of the city center, to a site a few kilometers away known as Babi Yar. Babi Yar, the Babushka or Grandmother Ravine, ran between 3 districts of Kyiv. It was a wide and steep ravine that many of the Jews now being marched towards it had played in as children, or had passed by 1,000 times in their daily lives. As they approached, the victims began to see barbed wire and anti-tank barriers set up to control the flow of people. German soldiers and Ukrainian police forces awaited them. They funneled the victims to bored-looking men sitting at desks, who were there to record the numbers and process them. The arrivals were recorded and then ordered to deposit all of their belongings with the German soldiers. Food, clothes, family treasures, precious documents, all were turned over. Then they were marched forward to an open field where they were ordered to strip off the clothes they were wearing, before being sent on in groups of about 100 into Babi Yar. What happened next might be best described by Kurt Werner, one of the very men who perpetrated the massacre. As soon as I arrived at the execution area, I was sent down to the bottom of the ravine with some of the other men. It was not long before the first Jews were brought to us over the side of the ravine. The Jews had to lie face down on the earth by the ravine walls. There were 3 groups of marksmen down at the bottom of the ravine, each made up of about 12 men. Groups of Jews were sent down to each of these execution squads simultaneously. Each successive group of Jews had to lie down on top of the bodies of those that had already been shot. I still recall today the complete terror of the Jews when they first caught sight of the bodies. Each group of Jews was marched to the bottom of the ravine, where they were made to lie down on the ground. German troops then began executing them one by one. Others were left standing when they were shot, and were left to drop down onto the pile. Some reports say they marched to the edge of the ravine and then shot, so their bodies would fall forward into the piles. The lucky ones were killed by the gunshot. However, many were still alive when the next group was brought in. And so the process repeated dozens upon dozens of times, from sunrise to sunset. Men, women, and children all went to the ravine. With each fresh group, the bottom of the ravine became more choked with corpses and echoed with the cries of those below who were still alive, writhing in pain among the bodies of their friends and families, and crushed underfoot as new victims came in. This method of mass murder was known as sardine packing, and would continue to be implemented in later Holocaust massacres by the Einsatzgruppen. Kurt Werner's testimony is particularly insightful and terrifying in this regard. He admitted to spending hours in the ravine, shooting new groups of Jews throughout the morning. Later, he was rotated out to load ammunition into magazines for the shooters, and later he helped escort new groups to the massacre site. The Einsatzgruppen had reduced murder to an efficient process that even knew how to rotate its men to maximize efficiency and minimize the psychological risk of keeping one man on killing duty for too many hours at a time. One of the Jews who was marched into that ravine was Dina Pronicheva. Dina had worked in a puppet theater before the war forced her into service of the Red Army, where she worked in communications. She remained behind in Kyiv as the army retreated, and, as a Jew, was counted among the Jews of Kyiv by the occupying forces. Like the other 33,000 victims, Dina obeyed the summons on September 29th and was marched to the edge of the Babi Yar ravine. However, the gunshot did not kill her. Like so many others, she was left to suffer slowly atop piles of fellow victims, as new victims were shot and dropped on top of her. The gunshot wound proved to be non-lethal, and through luck, she managed to avoid suffocating under the weight of fresh corpses which continued to pile up until nightfall. Dina was still alive when the gunfire stopped that evening. She had not moved or spoken for hours, knowing they'd kill her if she did. She could only listen as the Germans and their local collaborators began walking over the corpses, checking for and executing survivors, before covering the bodies over. One of the soldiers inspecting the bodies noticed her and seemed to suspect she was alive. He walked over and crushed her wrist with his boot, testing for a reaction. Dina managed to avoid screaming or giving a reaction that the man would be able to spot in the darkness. It worked, and the man walked off, saving his bullets for the other survivors. Dina remained silent as the soldiers began piling dirt and sand atop the corpses. Fighting the urge to cough as the dirt filled her throat, Dina endured for hours more until the shoveling stopped and the men walked off. Slowly, Dina clawed her way out of the thin layer of dirt the lazy soldiers had dumped on top of her and began crawling over the bodies to the edge of the ravine. The bodies were piled so high that even with her broken wrist, she was able to pull herself up to the edge, up and out of the ravine. There, she heard a whisper and found a young boy named Martin, who had also crawled his way free. Together, they silently sneaked away under the cover of night. However, they did not make it far before encountering German soldiers. Martin was the first to notice them and quietly warned Dina, but he wasn't quiet enough. The Germans heard him, found him, and shot him on the spot. Thankfully, they did not understand what he had said and did not think to search for Dina, who managed to hide long enough for the Germans to leave. Dina went on to escape the immediate area. She would eventually be captured and kept as a servant girl, but ultimately survived the war. She was one of only 28 known survivors of the Babi Yar Massacre, and the only one who would give their testimony at the 1946 trial, held by the Soviets to punish Germans and collaborators for their actions in Ukraine. The massacre continued on the following day, as the remains of the Jews were added to new piles. When all was done, the Germans collapsed the sides of the ravine over the execution sites with dynamite to bury the bodies. No heed was given to the shouts of the Jews who were still alive. Suffocation would deal with them. Still, one eyewitness recalled years later how, quote, "the earth was moving long after, because wounded and still alive Jews were still moving. One girl was crying, 'Mammy, why did they pour the sand into my eyes?'" Even before the killing had stopped, the soldiers were combing through the victims' possessions. They picked through the massive piles of discarded clothes and bundles of luggage like vultures. They stole money and mementos from the dead, and soldiers spent many days carefully retrieving all the banknotes, which they estimated totaled in the millions. When all was done, the clothes were gathered up and shipped back to be donated to charity for use of the needy population in Kyiv and ethnic Germans elsewhere in Europe. The story of Babi Yar was only just beginning, however. The The site continued to be a favorite of the Nazis and their collaborators until the Soviets recaptured the area in the winter of 1943. Tuesdays and Fridays were regularly scheduled execution days, where hundreds more victims would be sent to the ravine. On top of the 33,000 killed on September 29th and 30th, 1941, another 70,000 or so were killed over the following 2 years. In addition, Babi Yar was also the dumping ground for the victims of Wilhelm Gustav Schuppe, the Nazi physician assigned to apply Nazi eugenics policy to Kyiv. He and his team sterilized and euthanized thousands of disabled and racially targeted individuals in Kyiv over the next 2 years, whose bodies were then tossed into Babi Yar with the execution victims. As for the members of the Einsatzgruppen units who had perpetrated the massacre, Babi Yar did not even count for the majority of their atrocities. By mid-October 1941, their reports claimed a total of 100,000 Jews killed since the invasion began. By 1943, with the Germans being pushed back, they realized that the evidence of the massacres at Babi Yar might be weaponized against them to mobilize Soviet resistance, or if the war continued to go against them, as evidence in any post-war trials. Paul Blobel, who had directed the Babi Yar massacre in the first place, was ordered back there in August 1943 with his Sonderkommando 4A unit to destroy evidence of the massacre. Using slave labor from the nearby Sidetz concentration camp, Blobel and his men uncovered the bodies and used industrial equipment to destroy as many of them as they could. Pyres were built and doused with petrol so the rest of the bodies could be burned. It was impossible to cover up all of the evidence. Many bodies escaped destruction, and while the Nazis tried to execute all of the concentration camp inmates involved, many managed to slip through the cracks. Combined with the accounts and testimony of the perpetrators and survivors after the war, the Nazis failed to cover up Babi Yar entirely. The reassertion of Soviet control after 1943 spelled an end to the horrors at Babi Yar, but its legacy was complicated and underexplored. Stalin's USSR had its own intense problems of anti-Semitism, and the specific targeting of Jews at Babi Yar was downplayed in favor of emphasizing a collective Soviet victimhood. Collaborationism was mostly downplayed, and little was done to understand why people might have collaborated, or address the underlying attitudes against Jews and other minorities that led to it. It took decades for the massacre to even receive a memorial, and it was little known outside of Ukraine and the Jewish community for many years. The publication of Yevgeny Yevtushenko's 1961 poem Babi Yar, and its subsequently being put to music by the acclaimed composer Dmitri Shostakovich, was the first time that many outside of the Soviet Union had heard of the massacre. Over the following years, accounts of the massacre by survivors or witnesses, such as Anatoly Kuznetsov's 1966 work Babi Yar, a document in the form of a novel, publicized what had happened. By the time the USSR fell and Ukraine achieved independence, the name of Babi Yar was well known. One of the first things the Ukrainian government did in regards to its history was order a new, larger monument at Babi Yar to better commemorate the horrors that had taken place there. The massacre has also been mired in controversy in recent years, thanks to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The part played by Ukrainian collaborators in the massacre has been seized upon by the Russian government to craft a myth that Ukraine as a whole was and remains a Nazi state, and therefore Russia is justified in invading it. That the victims of Babi Yar were also Ukrainians of varying ethnicities, faiths, political allegiances, and social classes goes conspicuously unmentioned in Putin's propaganda. Surviving records from the Einsatzgruppen confirm that 33,771 Jewish civilians were killed within about 24 hours, on the 29th and 30th of September 1941. Going by the number of dead in a given time frame, it was the deadliest 24 hours of the entire Holocaust. When combined with the tens of thousands more killed afterwards, Babi Yar is perhaps the single deadliest site in the Holocaust, outside of the extermination camps. The greater attention paid to Babi Yar in recent decades has helped us to understand it more. There have been concerted efforts to memorialize and educate on the events that took place there, and the only consolation its victims can have is that they are no longer forgotten. However, the Nazi and Soviet attempts to bury the events did much harm to our historical knowledge. There is little hope of new documents coming to light, and new eyewitness accounts are no longer an option. As of 2025, just one eyewitness of Babi Yar survives, Mikhail Petrovich Sitko, who was only 6 when his family was murdered in the ravine. The bodies that the Germans were not able to destroy still lie beneath the soil at Babi Yar. There have been suggestions to exhume and rebury them, but such a task is morally debatable, and no plans have been implemented. Even if they were, it would be a monumental undertaking to properly account for the thousands of people who still lie down there. For now, the victims of Babi Yar rest where they were slain, and the ravine remains one of the most harrowing historical sites anywhere on Earth.